Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here, for taking the time out of your evening to listen to this lecture about African penguins. It's a great opportunity to talk to many of you that may not have been able to make it to the zoo if we'd been doing this in person, so we can take the small positives out of this particular situation that we can. So it's really great that you're all here. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, you might go away with a slightly better understanding, not only of the challenges that African penguins face, but also what a fantastic species they are to work with, and that hopefully you'll continue to be able to visit South Africa and see them in the wild for many years to come. So my name is Ellie, and I am one of the lecturers here at Bristol Zoological Society. And I have been leading the African penguin conservation project here at the zoo since 2017. So it's still definitely very much a work in progress, but it's been a really fantastic project to take on. And we're looking at expanding this project now and into the future, and that makes it a really exciting place to be and a really fantastic species to work on. So because this is a slightly different lecture series in terms of it being about stories from the field, I thought I would start by introducing myself a little bit, just so that you know a little bit about my fieldwork experience, because this is a little bit about what it's like to work with animals and to be out in the field, especially for many of you that might be interested in working in the field in the future, if you're young, or wondering what it's like sometimes being a scientist out in the field. You may or may not be able to hear from my voice, but I am actually from New Zealand. And so my fieldwork and conservation journey started there. I was working on a project looking at training dogs to avoid killing kiwi in national parks. Because in New Zealand, we have a lot of dogs that are hunting dogs and things like that that go into national parks. And so we were interested in being able to undergo training to get permits and things so they could safely enter national parks and avoid killing kiwi. So that was where I kind of started on this journey. And as many people that are scientists that work in the field will know, a lot of this starts with a love of travel and a love of visiting new places. And that was certainly the case for me. And so during this time, I worked in a lot of centers around Central South America and Indonesia, looking at rescue and kind of rehabilitation where possible of kind of confiscated animals that came from the police, from the illegal pet trade, and things like that. Just to note as well that there aren't any pictures in here that may be traumatic, unlike Gronya's lecture a few weeks ago. So hopefully that will be put your minds at rest. So I did a lot of traveling in my early years, and I spent a lot of time understanding a little bit more about the conservation issues facing a lot of the different species around the country. But a lot of it was quite forest-based. And quite interestingly, my kind of scientific journey into the field didn't really begin until I did my PhD. And in this sense, it was a bit unusual. So I sidestepped conservation a little bit and undertook a PhD on kind of another scientific love of mine, which is evolutionary biology. And so I was really interested in sexual selection, the evolution of sexual traits. And that might be not what you expected to hear about tonight, but I think it's interesting to note that you can come at this from a lot of different angles. And so the species that I was working on in the Malaysian rainforest in the middle of the night was this guy, a really fascinating invertebrate called a stork-eyed fly. And they have a sexually selected trait in their eye span. So the eyes are those things on the end that are coming out of its head, and those are the end of the stalks. And the females prefer the males with the longest eye stalks. And so I was studying those in the Malaysian rainforest in the middle of the night, and that gave me a really formative experience of what the field is like. It's quite an interesting place to work. Like Gronya said last week, it's quite intense, and there's a lot that can go wrong and a lot can happen in the forest and in the field with all sorts of animals. And it has similarities and differences to working out with the penguins. But I was working out in the forest in Malaysia, like I said, and that was really influential for me in my love of field work and my love of being out in the field, working on different species. And as I've come back into conservation, that's continued, and I really love going out into different places and seeing particularly things like the penguins. I'll be really interested to explore that a little bit more into the future. And just to note, in terms of stories from the field, one of the early ones you learn, so that's me working in the night in the middle picture there around the campfire. And you might be wondering what's beside that pot there. That is a pair of socks. And if you're thinking that they are quite close to the fire, you would not be wrong. And so one of the first things that you might learn is not to put flammable things quite close to fires. But that's a bit of the fieldwork experience. And then I came back into conservation. And one of the things I'm really fascinated in is understanding this interlink between evolution and conservation. And despite the fact that penguins are kind of a monogamous species, as a few of the scientists who work with them very well will be able to tell you, they have incredibly unique personalities, and some of them have really interesting mate choice decisions and things like that. So they're definitely interesting to me from that side of it as well. So that's my journey. And now I just want to kind of pull back a little bit and talk about the society for a second, because one of the things that we find really interesting is that kind of a lot of people that we meet, even people that live in Bristol, have no idea about the conservation work that Bristol Zoo undertake and that we do. And so at the moment we're guided by our conservation master plan, which runs over 5 years and allows us to undertake with our team. We have a team, a fantastic team of scientists and lecturers to guide our work through the next few years in a kind of cohesive manner and kind of maximize the conservation output that we're able to do given the kind of size of the zoo that we are. And our conservation work falls under 3 strands. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is obviously much more about field conservation and research. But also there are other strands to this kind of organization and the conservation work we undertake. So we're interested in obviously breeding threatened species. We have a fantastic animal team and keeper team, which do some wonderful work breeding a lot of threatened species, either as a kind of insurance population or also potentially for rehabilitate or for release back into the wild in some cases, particularly our invertebrates. And the third strand is about behavior change. And that might not be something that a lot of people are familiar with. But it's really important. We get a lot of people through the doors at Bristol Zoo and at Wild Place. And although a lot of those people might be coming just for a day out, something for their kids to do, I have 2 young kids, I fully get it. One of the most important things we can do is to try and provide some kind of education or some new information about potential conservation problems and potentially really easy things that the public can do to try and help with those problems. And so we have this behavior change campaign system running where we might be teaching or talking about sustainable palm oil or about FSC, sustainable kind of wood and paper products, and what you might be able to do for that in the future if you just go to the supermarket and buy something that's labeled correctly, for example. And we have a wonderful conservation psychologist campaign manager who runs that. And the outcome of that is that we have kind of a now cohesive platform for our conservation work. So we work in 10 countries and we target 18 different species. And so now this is really setting up the zoo to maximize kind of what we're able to do as an organization. And if we look at that on a map, then what we can see is we have 2 kind of main hubs of work. We have other projects around the world, but we do have 2 kind of main hubs. One is here in the UK. We have a wonderful UK conservation manager who works on native white-clawed crayfish. We have invasive weed project, wild place project, for example. And then we have a lot of projects in Africa. So we have work in Madagascar, Equatorial Guinea, like you heard in Gronya's talk a few weeks ago, Cameroon, and Tanzania. But where I'll be taking you today and for the rest of the talk is South Africa and Namibia. So this is where we find the African penguin. And for many of you, this might still be quite a foreign thing to think about, is kind of penguins in Africa. A lot of you will be thinking, if you think about penguins, you're conjuring up images of large ice sheets in Antarctica. But penguins have taken over the world. They've colonized all sorts of places. South America, we have the Galapagos penguin, which is the most northerly species of penguin, Australia and New Zealand, and we have the African penguin. So the African penguin breeds in 3 main kind of cluster points, if you like, breeding colonies around 3 main points. Up in Namibia, so we kind of, a lot of people think about the African penguin as South African, but actually there is a proportion of the population, around 20%, that breed up in Namibia on 4 main islands. And then we have 2 big breeding clusters in South Africa as well. We have the cluster around the Western Cape, so around Cape Town, places like Robben Island, Boulders in Simonstown, Stony Point, and Destin and Dyer Island. And then also we have a cluster around the Eastern Cape, so around Port Elizabeth and Algoa Bay. So we have these kind of three really distinct kind of breeding points for the penguins, all kind of separated by 600 kilometers. So really, really far apart for these really distinct clusters. And if we just talk about the country for a second, like I said, South Africa, for a lot of people, especially if you've just been inland or if you haven't been, it definitely conjures up images of the Big Five, of Kruger National Park, really wide open spaces. And I think the first time that you go and you see a penguin on a beach in Africa, it never ceases to be kind of quite amazing and disconcerting, I guess. And really, it's really fascinating to see them in this kind of environment that you never really imagine. So this is Boulders Beach. It's a huge tourist attraction in South Africa. And it's also one of the last mainland colonies, breeding colonies left. So mainland colonies can be a little bit problematic for the penguins, just because of land-based predation and kind of human interference, if you like. But Boulders Beach is one of the last mainland breeding colonies, and you get huge numbers of tourists there. So it's really important to the South African government, which is a very good thing. It's good for the penguins to be important, for sure. And so the other country where they are is Namibia. And right in kind of off the coast of Namibia on a number of islands, kind of around the Namib Desert. It's quite an isolated and quite windy place, I have been told. And this is Halifax Island, which is one of the islands where you find the remaining population of African penguins. It's not somewhere I've been, and I'm really excited to explore that a little bit further because there's some really interesting things that are happening in Namibia. So quite aside from the kind of conservation, which I am going to focus on today, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background, I guess, about some of the interesting things that are that happen with the African penguins, a little bit about their background. So they're really fascinating in their own right. They have a unique set of spots on their coat. So each African penguin has a set of black dots on their chest, and each of those kind of set of dots is unique to each individual penguin, just like a human fingerprint is. And there was some really interesting early work looking at whether that is a really good way to ID them in that manner. So it's a really fascinating point. Also, if you can see these pink glands on this picture of this penguin here, these glands are an adaptation to living in obviously a much hotter climate, so in Africa. They have these pink glands which are used for kind of thermoregulation, so the ability to control their temperature. The hotter the penguin gets, the more kind of blood is being sent up into these glands, and the pinker they get, and then that is cooled off by the surrounding air. So that's a really nice kind of little adaptation that these penguins have. And here we have, these are monogamous birds, so they mate for life in theory, and they work together to raise their chicks. So they will, basically you'll have two parents that will be on a nest. They'll go on alternating fishing trips. So one parent will go off for around 24 hours, fishing, come back, relieve the other parent who was sitting on the nest, and they do that back and forward, raising their chick for kind of around 2 to 4 months. Once the chicks are a little bit older, then both parents will head out to sea and will leave the chicks unguarded in the nest. And then those chicks will often kind of creche together. So you'll get a couple of different nests of chicks kind of all kind of congregating together, which is quite wonderful. Once they have chosen a colony to breed, so they'll make a kind of a decision about when to breed at around 3 to 4 years of age. They will return to that same colony every year. And in some cases, the same burrow, they have quite high fidelity to the place they decide to breed. And there's some really interesting work that's been done on that. And then you also get your completely unique and crazy individuals who will just decide to mate with multiple people and try and keep everything going all at once. So although they look exactly the same, all these penguins, they have definitely unique personalities. So like I said, an adult pair will raise their chicks for around 2 to 4 months before the chicks fledge. And then what will happen is that just one day the adults won't come back to feed the chicks, and those chicks will get hungry and they will eventually head out to sea. And so they'll potter off, and the parents then don't provide any kind of input into learning to fish or anything like that. Those chicks will have to learn on their own. And that's quite important for some of the conservation work which we see happening. And they're really long-lived birds. They can live upwards of 25 years. And so they really are kind of one of those animals that require stability throughout their kind of life and their adult life to maintain breeding year on year. So they're really quite fascinating. But what I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about is the kind of situation with them. So around the turn of the 20th century, although estimates vary, there could have been up to around 3 million birds. So they were a really populous species around South Africa and Namibia. Populations have crashed dramatically since then. And we've seen also a really sharp recent decline. So not only kind of a consistent decline since the turn of the century, but also a very recent sharp one. So we've lost up to 95% of all of the African penguins. And the estimations around this year are around 20,000 breeding pairs left, which is the lowest it's ever been. And that was kind of from earlier this year. And we've had really particularly severe losses around the Western Cape, where we work, and where the kind of the traditional stronghold of the species has been. Recent research showed that kind of without prompt conservation action, that Western Cape stronghold will be functionally extinct by 2035, which is only 15 years away from now. So we really need to make sure that this is a top priority and that everything is being done possible. So these are a couple of threats, a couple of things, kind of some historic, some current, a bit sporadic, which might have they're having an impact on African penguin populations. So oil spills can be potentially catastrophic. We can see a picture here of African penguins that have been oiled. So just as an example, in the year 2000, the MV Treasure Ship had an oil spill off the Western Cape, and it resulted in 19,000 oiled penguins being taken in and over 3,000 abandoned chicks being rescued. And they estimated that nearly 20% of the entire population of African penguins at that time was affected by that oil spill. And so they can have really very serious implications if they happen in and around the penguin breeding, penguin colonies. Disease is also kind of a constant unknown threat of when it's going to hit. We're all very aware of what that means for us, but it happens in penguins as well. So for example, in 2018, when I was out there, they had an avian influenza outbreak. And that resulted in the death of over 350 penguins up in Namibia. And so you can get these kind of sporadic outbreaks, which can cause serious implications now that the population is so naturally vulnerable. Equally, predation occurs. So we have predation on land and sea, land predation by leopards and caracals if it's a mainland colony, and predation by sharks and seals in the sea. And really that's not a problem in general because that's part of the natural cycle. But what we do know is that when these populations are particularly vulnerable anyway and declining, then any kind of major predation event can have really bad impacts. And it's something we have to think about if we're looking at mainland colonies in the future, which I'll talk about towards the end. The removal of guano is quite an interesting one. So basically the penguins historically had nested or burrowed into guano. So for those of you wondering what guano is, it is their poo. So the poo builds up, and then they use that within their kind of nest to create an environment that protects them from the elements, protects the nest and the chicks. It's the right temperature. Everything is nice and stable down there. Unfortunately, it makes great fertilizer. And so humans have come along and scraped all of that guano off the islands to use for fertilizer. And now the penguins are left with very little in the way of habitat to nest into. It's worse in some islands and some colonies than others, but it's definitely a habitat kind of loss issue, a nesting modification issue. And for some islands, they're looking at artificial nest boxes, for example, to see if that can have an impact. And a lot of the American zoos have had a big hand in that work. And finally for this, egg collection. Now this is definitely quite historic, but definitely would have had an impact on the initial declines that we saw in African penguins back at the turn of the century. So people realized that African penguin eggs were probably quite tasty and large. And so they began collecting and eating them. And they estimate that 13 million penguin eggs were taken. So this no doubt contributed a lot to the initial declines. It doesn't happen anymore, but certainly would have historically. Now, I would love to tell you that is what the threats are for African penguins, but unfortunately I've just guided you through some of the sporadic or minor or historic threats that are facing this species, because there is a big one. And this is the threat about food. So in a nutshell, the fish that the penguins need to feed off is no longer available to them in the quantities they need. That is essentially the big problem. So they feed on anchovy and sardine. This is the kind of high quality food that they need to be nice and fat, to be able to move around, to be able to raise their chicks successfully. So this is their kind of primary source of food. And the reason that there's no longer the sardine and anchovy available to them is twofold. The first is overfishing. So they have been fished out or overfished in a number of locations. And this is kind of might be surprising to some people, because it's not the kind of species that you think of as being overfished, because we don't tend to eat it. You often think of things like tuna when we think about overfishing. But actually we've lost a lot of these, and slightly ironically, a lot of this forage fish, these sardines and anchovies, actually end up in the as food for farmed fish. So that is one of the major problems, is that it's kind of that movement of wild forage fish into the farm fishing industry. So there's an overfishing issue, and then there's also a climate change issue. So in this kind of quite unique ecosystem that they have around South Africa and Namibia, called the Benguela, climate change is shifting a lot of the currents and the upwellings and moving those fish stocks that remain eastward. So here's a little graphic from a paper from a collaborator of mine, Rich Shirley, from his recent paper. And so I'll just take a little minute to explain it to you. So essentially what is happening is that those fish stocks are moving eastward, and the penguins are going in the opposite direction. So Rich did a really nice study, Rich and his colleagues, where they tracked 54 young penguins, so juvenile penguins, to see where they were going essentially. And what he found is that those penguins are traveling thousands of kilometers up the coast into Namibia. Now that Namibian ecosystem, which was once a thriving place for sardine and anchovy, is now completely degraded. So now it's full of things like jellyfish and goby, which are kind of really low quality food for the African penguin. And it's a little bit like if you need, if you're running a marathon, for example, and you really need high quality, you need bananas, you need things that are going to keep you sustained, and someone lays out loads of like cucumber. I mean, it's food and you're going to eat it, but it's not the kind of quality that you need to sustain yourself. And so what Rich found was that the ocean was essentially providing these signals for the penguins to go up into this ecosystem. So things like the sea surface temperature and the chlorophyll alpha level. So these are the signals the penguins are using. They're thinking, the sea is telling me that that's going to be a great area for fish, so I'm going to go up there. And when they arrive there, there are no fish. And so that's what they call an ecological trap, where the environment is effectively trapping them into moving into areas that are no longer suitable in terms of high productivity or lots of fish available. And what he found was that penguins from populations that ended up making this trip up to Namibia, they had around a projected 50% population decline compared to those that didn't make this trip up and went to other locations. So this is quite a serious problem for the survival and the breeding of the African penguins, is this kind of lack of food and the shift in fish stocks. So not only are the fish stocks no longer there in some cases, they've moved in a completely different direction to the penguins. And so that is the kind of problem that we're facing, of how do we rematch up this situation, and it is not an easy question to answer. Okay, so that's a little bit of a very broad brush overview of some of the threats facing African penguins. And while there is some fantastic work, which I'll touch on later, I want to talk a little bit about the project itself that we have at the zoo. So like I said, I took over the African Penguin Project in 2017, so a few years ago now. And I've been trying to look at where to move this project to have more of an impact on the ground, and to be more kind of more useful to actual conservation. So we've been working with African penguins since 2006, and there's been some nice work in and around that, but primarily it's been a funding project. So we've been working with SANCOB, who are a fantastic NGO on the ground in South Africa doing the kind of rescue, rehabilitation and release work of the African penguins. And I'll talk about that work in a bit more detail in a minute. But essentially since 2006, we've been supporting SANCOB. And that's been probably the extent of the project, other than some collaborations with other scientists. And so what I wanted to do is to look at moving that forward a little bit more. And so we've joined up with the scientists who work on Earthwatch to try and see if we can at least go out and help support, do some of the population monitoring, which is really critical out on Robben Island. So this is a project that's been running for 20 years with a fantastic group of conservation scientists and in collaboration with Earthwatch volunteers who have been collecting kind of breeding success data and chick condition data out on Robben Island to give us a really nice idea of how that particular colony is coping with all these changes. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then the third thing which I've been doing is looking at the research. So obviously I'm a scientist, so my first, one of my great loves is kind of engaging in the science. And for African penguins, there's a lot of science we do need to know. There's a lot we still don't know about African penguins, about how they're responding to these threats, where they're going, how conservation measures are doing in terms of success. So there's three kind of general strands that I've been working on over the last few years, just building them up. There's still a long way to go. The first is a collaboration with Rich Shirley, who I mentioned earlier. And we have a fantastic PhD student, Jenny, who is looking at tracking immature penguins. And so I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail, but essentially the penguins between 1 and 3 years of age, so not the fledglings and not the breeding adults, but that kind of middle ground, is kind of a lost science a knowledge gap for us because we don't really know where they're going, what they're doing, how they're prospecting potential breeding sites or anything like that. So there's a lot we don't know about that age group, which is really critical. And so she's beginning to do some work trying to understand that a little bit more. The second thing is a collaboration with the University of the West of England, where we are interested in seeing if on a very broad brush scale, we can use a kind of non-invasive, cheap, kind of quick measure of seeing where penguins are in their environment in potentially key areas that we're interested in, and how that matches up with fish stocks in the area as well. So I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And also genotyping. So we have just started a genetics lab at Bristol Zoo. And so in a collaboration with Kata at SANCOB, we're bringing over some samples to be able to genotype and add to a really critical marking transponder data set which we have for the African penguins. So I want to just talk about each of these in a little bit more detail to give you some idea of what the background is and what's happening. So SANCOB, they are a really fantastic organization. We've worked with them, like I said, since 2006 when we began the chick bolstering project. So the chick bolstering project is quite a specific project which has come about because of quite a sad situation. So essentially what happens is the adults come in to breed, the pairs come in, they lay their first their first clutch, if you like. And because of the current situation with the fish, a lot of those adults are coming in quite poor condition, or they are just unable to successfully rear that first nest for whatever reason. And so you're getting quite high failure rates of that initial kind of nest. They might come in February, March time. And then there's kind of starting the process of breeding, and then you're getting a lot of failures at that point. So what they do is they regroup, they kind of get in better condition, and they start again, and they try for a second nest in that same season. And for a lot of those, that is more successful. So you will get those eggs being successfully hatched, and they will be raising those chicks. But this is now happening much later on in the breeding season than they initially should have been. And so what actually happens is that every year, these penguins essentially go into molt. And so what molt means is they have to get rid of their old feathers, and they grow a nice new brand new waterproof set. And so this happens at the end of the year, every year, for every single penguin. You can't stop it. It's just one of those processes that has to happen. And so what we find is happening is that these penguins, because they're now on their second clutch, they're going into molt in the middle of raising their chicks. And that is a big problem, because when they're in molt, they cannot go out to sea. So they cannot go and get fish for their young. And so what you will find is adult penguins in molt beside their little chicks, who are essentially starving to death. But the penguin adults are right there, but the adults are unable to go and feed them. And so you're getting really high levels of kind of abandoned chicks because of the kind of poor condition that they initially came in to breed. And so what sandcob do will take those abandoned chicks, they will rear them up, make them nice and fat, and release them at exactly the same time they would have been released. They would have fledged anyway into the wild. And that's not an insignificant number of chicks that they have done that with. So you can see there on that graphic, there are over 8,000 penguin chicks have been reared. And if you think, when I was saying that the current kind of breeding population is around 20,000 breeding pairs, that is not an unsubstantial amount of the population which sandcob have been working with. So it's a really, really good initiative. They have really high success rates of getting those penguins back out into the wild. And of course, you have to do research to make sure that what you're doing is actually a good thing and a successful thing. And initial work which came out looking at survival rates of sandcob raised chicks and wild parent raised chicks showed that there was no significant difference in survival. So those sandcob chicks which are going out are doing really well. And so hopefully, actually, one of the things that they'll be able to look at is looking at breeding. So a lot of those first chicks that they kind of tagged and monitored are now coming into breed. And so we'll get a really nice idea of how those chicks are breeding and if there's any difference between those and wild-born chicks as well. So that's some of the work that we support with sandcob, and we have a really good research relationship with them as well. So they've been a very good organization for us. So this is Robben Island, famously home to Nelson Mandela during his term in prison. Now a tourist site, so you can go to Robben Island on a tour and visit the prison and learn all about his time there. And it also is home to quite a large penguin colony, which many people don't know, and even if you have done the tour, you also probably don't know. But it has a great penguin colony and is home to the Earthwatch project for South African penguins. So Earthwatch volunteers and conservation scientists have been running this, like I said, for 20 years now. And these long-term data sets which they gather are really critical to our understanding of African penguins, how these penguins are coping with this kind of threats and changes, and exactly what's happening with survival and breeding success and recruitment. So it's really, really important that we get these data sets. We know that for penguins globally, these kind of data sets are very hard to come by. This is one of the best examples of one in the world for penguins. And it's been really fascinating to get to know it a little bit more over the last few years. I should have been out there this year helping to lead a team, but unfortunately I am not, but hopefully next year. So as I showed you in the previous, or a couple of slides ago for Boulders Beach, there's a beautiful beach, beautiful golden sands and lovely penguins kind of nesting everywhere. That is not quite the case on Robben Island, but it makes it all the more entertaining, I guess. And so these penguins will nest in some quite interesting habitat, and they like to get right under these quite spiky bushes. So they're a little bit harder to spot. I hope you can spot the penguin in both of these pictures. It's kind of a Where's Wally? And so a couple of the things that we're interested in, primarily interested in breeding success. So how are the penguins doing? How many penguins are coming in? Where are they breeding? How well are those chicks and those eggs doing? How many are you getting to fledge? And we're also interested in how specifically the chicks are doing. So we do some measurements for chick condition, which is all about how much the chicks weigh versus how big they are. And we measure how big they are by measuring their head here, which is what Rich is doing. Obviously, whenever we handle any of the birds, it's done with the utmost kind of care for their welfare and minimum time, and the parents are always very happy to have them back. But we look at head length as a measure of size, and then also we weigh them to see how much they weigh. And we can then tell, based on how big they are or how old they are, how fat are they, how good are they doing, how well are those parents doing in bringing fish back. And if we really see underweight chicks, so chicks that are measuring quite big but are very, very small in terms of weight, then they can go to Sandcob to be reared up and released so that we don't lose those chicks as well. But it's just to get a really good idea of what is happening and be able to monitor this island really successfully. So the Earthwatch volunteers will go out for 2 weeks at a time across the breeding season, so from March to August. And it covers kind of the breeding season really nicely over in South Africa, and we can get a really good handle on what is happening. So I've just started to go out a few times for this project, and I'm really looking forward to going out again when hopefully we can travel again, which would be great. And I want to bring us back now and talk a little bit more about the research. It's something I'm quite excited about, and I'm hoping that in the future this will hopefully prove useful as from a conservation perspective. But what I really want to do now is tie these research components together. So they all look quite disparate right now, but I do have a common interest. And so what I'm interested in across all of these is looking at how penguins are using their environments. Particularly, we've got new marine protected areas in South Africa, for example. And I'm really interested in where kind of key foraging locations are, what areas need the most protection, what areas are currently protected, but the penguins just aren't using, or they're traveling through without kind of utilizing. And where are the fish in all of this? Where's the biomass? And where do we really need to focus our energies? And so that's the kind of thread that ties all the work that I'm interested in together. But like I said, this is still quite new, and I'm still developing this definitely as time moves on. But that's the kind of interest for me of where this goes. So this is a project in collaboration with the University of Exeter, where Rich and Steve Vautier are. And Jenny is our PhD student, and she is looking at, like I said, tracking immature penguins. So those penguins between 1 and 3 years. Now, the reason that we traditionally have no data on kind of where they are and where they're going is that they're very difficult to catch. So like I said, they come into to molt once a year, and they tend to hang out together on the beaches. They don't really kind of move into the colonies. So it's much easier to get a handle on the juveniles because you can track them before they fledge, and also to get a handle on the breeding adults because they come back to their nest, of course. But those immatures kind of they're like teenagers, just float around. And so getting a handle on what's happening with them has been much harder. So Jenny went out for her first field season last year. So this is a GPS tracker, and it basically pings off the location of that penguin up to a satellite and back to Jenny. And so Jenny tracked about 23 immature penguins last year. And we started to get a little bit of an idea about where these penguins are foraging, where they're moving around different kind of parts of South Africa and Namibia, and how that all kind of plays in together with what we know about juveniles and what we know about adults. Unfortunately, she should have been out in the field right now doing her field season. And so that's having to be shifted a little bit more to look at what we already know from large data sets, but hopefully that will be expanded on in the future as well. And it's becoming, it's a really interesting project, which will hopefully provide us with some really nice information about these kind of lost years that we know so little about. And then the next project, which I want to talk to you about, is about environmental DNA. So we know that now that we need to understand how where penguins are going and how this relates to kind of movement and presence of prey as well. And we know that tracking is incredibly useful for individual kind of movement. So if we really want to know where a penguin is going, we can track it really nicely using these GPS trackers. But obviously we have to handle the birds in order to put these trackers on. And also the trackers can be extremely expensive. It varies wildly, but they can be up to £1,000 a tracker. So extremely expensive technology. And so sample sizes tend to be very small, which is why you'll only see kind of, as we won't say 500 birds are tracked, of course. So small numbers. So they're very useful, but they have limitations. And so what we were interested in collaboration with Yui, was wondering whether we could use a kind of a cheap, non-invasive technology that would literally not involve the penguins whatsoever or the fish, and whether we could do that to get a kind of broad scale idea of where penguins were in their environment, and what areas they were particularly utilizing, and where the fish were in all this as well. Can we track them? We can find areas where fish are that penguins aren't, and vice versa. And we think we can do this. It needs a lot of work, but essentially what you do is that you collect water. So penguins, as they move through their environment, they shed DNA. So they shed feathers, they shed feces, all sorts of stuff. All that nice DNA gets dropped off into the water. You essentially just collect water samples, and you filter it down, and then you've got all the DNA from all the species that have been in that sample of water. And then you run some really simple genetics work, and you can get an idea of what species has been in there, and a very basic idea of DNA load, if you like. So how much DNA is present, which gives you a very rough idea of, there might be loads of penguins or not so many. So it's very broad. But it also can tell you whether there were fish there, what fish species, how kind of the DNA load of those fish species as well. And we can then obviously start to get a little bit, as we map these kind of water collection points, we might be able to get a little bit more of an idea about where these matches and mismatches are happening. So it's just another tool that we can hopefully add to the monitoring data set. Like I said, it's still in early days, so we've had some wonderful MRes students working on that this year. And we will have some more next year as well. And so they're all working on a lot of the lab kind of components. So as you can imagine, there's quite a lot we need to understand about where the DNA moves through the currents, degradation, so DNA length and things like that. So there's lots to work on, but it's a really exciting project, which I'm enjoying very much. And then finally, in terms of just the work that we're doing, I just want to touch on some genotyping we're doing. So this is a collaboration with Kata in Sandcob. Since 2013, all the hand-raised chicks that have come out of Sandcob, and then over 1,700 penguins as well, wild adults and chicks, have been fitted with these kind of transponders, these little pit tags, kind of like a little microchip in their legs. And that's now the national marking system for penguins in South Africa. And that's really useful. So it gives us obviously a unique ID of each penguin. And then what you need to be able to do is to find out where penguins are. So you need to be able to find them again once you've tagged them. The great thing about penguins in a lot of these breeding colonies is that they use these things they call penguin superhighways. So essentially most of the penguins will come in at certain points into the colony and will basically go down the highway and then shift off to their nest sites left, right and center. And so the good thing about that is that we can put ground readers, which is essentially a transponder reader, across the penguin superhighway, and every time a penguin will walk over it, it will record the unique number of that penguin, and so we know that that individual penguin has come into the colony. And also we have handheld devices that researchers and colony managers can use to and nests and things like that to check the ID of the penguins which are nesting. And then that can be attached to information about breeding success and things like that. So it's a really useful data set. But there are some bits and pieces that are missing, particularly the sex of the chicks, for example. So we are unable to sex those chicks. The penguins aren't sexually dimorphic. The adults are a tiny bit, but the chicks certainly not. And so at the moment, we don't know the sex of the chicks that have been tagged or transponded, sorry. And so we have been funding this work for a couple of years, getting a lot of those that data genotyped so that we can tell what sex those chicks are. And that's been done in South Africa, but that's changed now. And so we are in the process of bringing over, to begin with, 500 samples of feathers and blood samples of the chicks, to be able to do the genotyping in Bristol Zoo itself in the genetics lab. So that will be a really nice component, which we can then feed back into this really important data set. And it could provide loads of really useful data. Jenny will also be looking at that for her PhD in terms of dispersal and breeding site kind of selection and things like that. So there's lots of really interesting questions which will come out of this data set. So it's good to be able to contribute a little bit to that moving forward. I just want to finally touch on just bringing it back, I guess, to stories from the field and a little bit about what it is to be working with the penguins versus, say, the forest that I'm used to. So there are a lot of differences. The forest is definitely more kind of oppressive, but the penguin colonies are really interesting. So you're very exposed to the elements there, but they are wonderful places to work. The penguins have a lot of attitude, so you always have a lot of fun working with them. And the last time I went out, I was 6 months pregnant with my son. So he nearly got named after a penguin, but maybe not quite. And so that added another element to it. But the fieldwork in South Africa has been really, really interesting, a very different dynamic from what I'm used to. But again, everything has its own challenges, and you really have to enjoy being out there, being amongst nature, if you want to be working out in the field. And then I just want to finally just round off with next steps for the project, and also reasons to be optimistic, because I can fully appreciate that this talk is a little bit about the doom and gloom of the African penguin, and I don't want to end on that. But next steps for the project, like I said, this is still new. It's still only a couple of years old. And so we're expanding the project in a couple of different directions. And really the aim of that expansion is to increase our conservation impact, and maximize the kind of resource that we're able to put into it. The project at the moment is just me, so there's obviously a limit with manpower, but what you want to do is maximize what you can get out of that given that situation. And so we're looking at potentially new places that we can go where we might be able to have more of an impact. Working with SANCOB potentially for new for colony managers who make a real impact in the field. And so making sure all that research is useful for potentially governments in the future, to be able to use data and secure those kind of fishing quotas that we need to be tightened, and the marine protected areas that we need to be in place. So that's where we're looking, and hopefully in the next few years, if I give this talk again, you'll be able to see where we've moved to and where we've gone through with this project. So it's quite exciting. So keep an eye out to see where that goes. And in terms of optimism, there is a lot to be optimistic about, despite all intents and purposes of what I've just been talking about. A big one is the people, I really must say. The community of scientists and conservationists who work on African penguins are incredibly passionate and incredibly dedicated people with an amazing array of expertise. We will be able to, without a doubt, everyone working together, make a huge impact for African penguins. They are a really great group of people. The African penguin itself is an incredibly charismatic species, and really engaging, both when you work with them personally, but also just seeing them when you go to the zoo and watch them. They're a really fantastic species to work with, and that's a really good thing. And they're also really important for the tourism industry in South Africa, and that gives a bit more punch as well, which is really important. We're also beginning to get a little bit more of a handle on the threats. We're beginning to understand a little bit more about what the impacts are on the African penguins, where the problems lie, what life stages they lie with, and where we need to target to maximize kind of conservation impact in the future. And then finally, just to say that there's a lot of other work that's really exciting that's going on around African penguins. Just one of them, for example, is BirdLife South Africa, in collaboration with a lot of other people, are looking to set up a new colony, a new mainland colony, in between the Western and Eastern Cape Colony sets. So I told you earlier that those fish stocks are moving eastward. And so the idea is that you can set up a new colony of penguins kind of right where those fish are, and then hopefully those penguins won't need to move into those degraded areas. They'll have all the fish that they need available to them nearby, and hopefully that, that colony can get up and running and will be really useful into the future. So there's some really interesting work that's happening outside in and around the community as well. So that is where I want to leave it on an optimistic note. I want to thank everyone that we work with, a lot of collaborators which have been helping me as I begin this journey into African penguin conservation. All my current students and past as well, who are working on different components of this project, and all the organizations that we work with. So I would like to leave it there. I'll ask any questions. And also just a tiny note, obviously, Mark had a slide up earlier. The zoo is currently closed, so we have an appeal running if anyone is able to give any donations to support the zoo while we have a lot of animals to feed and not a lot of people to coming through the doors. That would be fantastic. But otherwise, I will open the floor out if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Ali. We have our first question from Emma Jane. So how are we going to encourage the penguins to follow where the fish are? But it sounds like you've kind of already answered that question by talking about relocating the colonies.
Yeah, so yeah, that's definitely one of the ways. So attracting the penguins, they've got a number of different ways that they can do that into areas where will hopefully be more suitable for them. And the new colony is certainly one of those where if you can move, if you can shift those penguins eastward, and what is actually happening is that those eastward colonies are doing better. naturally anyway, and those the Western Cape colonies are losing quite a lot of penguins, which is unfortunate, but it might end up balancing out. Those penguins will find that fish, and hopefully that will move them eastward.
So Elisa Reese asks, what kind of legislation is in place or specific protection for African penguins in South Africa?
So they've just set out a new plan of marine protected areas, one of which is around Robben Island. So one of the projects I didn't talk about because I don't have time is work that's been done on alternating penguin fishery closures around Robben Island to look at how that impacts on chick rearing, duration length of movement of penguins and things like that. So there's been a lot of work with the South African government to try and get data to enable them to provide this kind of protection that they need. And so there's a lot of work, Rich, for example, and Pete and Barbara, they do a lot of work with the South African government in order to try and control. There's a couple of things. Controlling fishing quotas is obviously going to be a huge one, especially moving forward. But also setting up these marine protected areas that are suitable in scale and in location. So that's going to be one of the main conservation things that the government is able to enact. Obviously, they're a protected species. They're endangered on the IUCN Red List. So all of that goes without saying. But in terms of conservation measures, the big things the government can enact is things around fishing quotas and around marine protected areas.
Thank you, Ali. I have a couple more questions. One from Lou, who is concerned about the reduction in tourism and the impact that that might have on the conservation for this species. And one of the questions is, how do you anticipate that changing perhaps after lockdown?
It's without a doubt, all tourism has been severely impacted by COVID. There is no doubt, and I'm sure South Africa are having to deal with that equally. It won't impact on the penguins as such because those penguins will continue on their day. So in terms of that area, the area is secure. The people working there is not reliant on the tourism. It's going to be the government that suffer in terms of the amount of money coming in. So in terms of the penguins, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Those penguins will continue to be looked after. They'll continue to be monitored. There's colony managers in place there, and that won't change no matter what the tourism situation is. But obviously, the entire situation is problematic from a tourism perspective. The government do get a lot of money in from Boulders Beach tourism, and therefore it increases the value of African penguins to the government. So we do need to make sure, fingers crossed, as kind of COVID is brought under control and that tourism will rise again. But I mean, yeah, as with all tourism, it will be affected, yeah.
Thank you, Ali. A question now from Emilia, age 7, who asks, what subjects should she study if she wishes to work with species like this in the future? Ali seemed to have frozen.
No, don't.
Oh. Ali, I'm just letting you know that I can't actually hear you at the moment, so it sounds like you might have gone offline. Hi everyone. I don't know if you can still hear me. Could somebody just let me know whether you can still hear me? Yes, okay. And am I right in thinking that you can't currently hear Ali? So it looks like Ali might have dropped from, can't see or hear her. It looks like she might have dropped from the call. Let's hope that she comes back online shortly. Oh, she's back.
I'm back. Sorry, Mark, my internet dropped out.
That's okay. So the last question that I had from was from Amelia, age 7, who asks, what subjects does she need to study in order to work with these species in the future?
That's a great question. So I would suggest the science of biology, and yeah, I would say it interests you because you can go in all sorts of different rooms, but definitely stick with biology and with the science communicators that work that way. But biology will be your path.
Thank you, Ali. Just letting you know that you're dropping out a little bit. We've had a similar question from a few different participants, which is to do with the sustainability of the fish stocks that this species depends on. So broadly speaking, the question is what's being done to ensure the future sustainability of, for example, the anchovy stocks that the species requires?
Yeah, well, that's obviously the big thing, isn't it? It's what I've been talking about. Is we need to make sure that that is stable. And the problem is that sustainable from the perspective of there being fish in the ocean, and sustainable from the perspective of there's enough fish for the penguins and for fishing quotas to be filled, and everything like that is quite a different question. And so it's ensuring that those fishing stocks and those fishing quotas are sustainable for everything that uses the oceans. And the problem seems to be is that it's not the kind of boom bust scenarios in the naturally anyway to be way more extreme. And so you'll get times where you're just not seeing any sardine or anchovy at all. And so, yeah, it's really about making sure that the government is and what is needed. But that's where the work is going. That is where a lot of people are dedicating their time to ensuring that those talks are happening and that everything is going to be sensible into the future and sustainable for the penguin populations.
Thank you, Ali. So as with last lecture, there are actually still quite a few more excellent questions about land-based colonies, about working across different countries, but unfortunately, we've run out of time for this lecture. So firstly, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for a wonderful lecture. And secondly, I'm now going to just share my screen, I hope, to show you that our next in our series of stories from the field will be our colleague, Dr. Tim Bray, who's going to give a talk about conserving lemur leaf frogs in Costa Rica. That's going to happen in 2 weeks' time. There is going to be a link to the Zoom event, as there was for today, on our Facebook page. If you wish, you can join our mailing list by sending an email to mabrahams@bristolzoo.org.uk, and I'll add you to our mailing list. But I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us tonight, and especially thank you to Ali for a wonderful lecture, and I hope you all stay happy and healthy.
Thanks, Matt.